Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
The Dougherty Museum houses a collection of antique automobiles, trucks, tractors, and musical instruments. It is located on Highway 287 about a mile south of Longmont. In the early 1970s, the Dougherty family decided to open their private collections to the public. In 1974, they began construction of a 29,000-square-foot building, which was completed in 1977. It is now open during the months of June, July, and August on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. It is also the site of the annual Yesteryear Farm Show, which is held the last weekend in August. The show features working displays of antique tractors and farm machinery, steam engines, stationary engines, threshing and baling demonstrations, blacksmithing, spinning and weaving, etc. Today, we will be looking at the agriculture machinery. Join us as we go inside for the first of two videos.
Good afternoon. My name is Doug Dougherty. We're at the Dougherty Museum south of Longmont. The museum has been open to the public since 1977. This is a collection started by Ray Dougherty, my father, in the early 40s and continued basically all through his life, adult life. Joining me this afternoon is Bob Howard, a good friend. This is Deacon Bob also at St. John's Catholic Church for many years. And Bob is also a principal in the Yesteryear Farm Show that started some 32 years ago. I think Bob's been with it 27 years, something like that. Bob restores engines and tractors. He's a skilled blacksmith and many other trades I probably don't even know about. I know he builds toys for grandchildren, and also he had a calliope at the farm show the last 2 years that he put together on a Model T truck. So Bob's a good friend and a good person to know, and he knows a lot about antiques and horse-drawn equipment. This afternoon we hope to work through the horse-drawn equipment and early farm tractor section of the museum and explore and tell about some of the things how the things developed over time in different companies that started, like for example Studebaker started building horse-drawn equipment in the 1850s and then got into cars up through the late 50s, I believe, before they went out of business. So a lot of those companies started in the carriage trade and transferred into the horseless carriages. Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
It's pretty amazing when you look at one piece of equipment and then one that's made a little later and another one that's made a little later than that, how you can still see the old technology develop into the newer technology all the way up to today. So hopefully we'll have an interesting tour and we'll be able to see a whole lot of neat and interesting antique equipment.
I hope so too. Bob, the first two items we're going to look at this afternoon are the scythe that you're holding and the McCormick Deering harvester that replaced the hand scythe. For centuries, wheat was cut with an instrument like this. Sometimes a group of men side by side wading into a wheat field. I don't want to even think about it.
That must have been grueling.
Yeah. So this machine came along. It has a sickle that cut the grain off. These revolve around, so when you're sitting here, you don't lean to the right, and it drags the grain off that table in clumps and drops them on a row on the ground. And then individuals came along and gathered up like this and hand tied it with twine, or maybe even the straw itself. They didn't have the twine. So it was a huge labor saver, and it was led into, of course, the binder that self-tied the grain replaced this. But for a number of years, this was a very sought-after machine if your neighbor had one and you didn't. you would definitely wanted to get a hold of one. My dad always liked this machine. It has some of the original paint on it yet, so it was always taken care of, even though technology went on by and passed it up. Whoever had it had a place in the barn somewhere where he could keep it. So it's kind of an interesting and a historic piece, really. This item is a John Deere manure spreader. This was found on a farm on Lookout Road just west of 287. It was the Myrocker farm. And some of the people who have lived in this area a long time might remember every spring the 3 to 5 acres of tulips they had that ran from the house down to the road.
Tulips?
Tulips. It was quite a sight because they had different colors and bands of rows. And again, some of the people that have been here over 50 years might possibly remember seeing that. This is a John Deere again, and it was a popular model. It was their first model, and it had low sides, so manure was all loaded with a hand fork, a manure fork. So you didn't have to throw it real high to get it in here. The floor is a moving conveyor belt. And again, it was the start of the mechanized manure spreaders. And if you had a dairy or small dairy or 10 cows or so, or a feedlot, you used these every spring or fall to spread the manure on your fields.
I noticed that it's pretty long. They must have made them longer back then when they were horse-drawn, so that they wouldn't have to come back and fill them up as often.
Probably a good point. Again, it's horse-drawn, as was the reaper we just visited. It was also horse-drawn.
They sure made them. They made them stout.
This sat out in the weather for many years. The slat floor, we had to replace a few of them, but it was hardwood and it didn't rot out. And my dad had to put new sides on it and painted it up. He just did it kind of for the fun of it.
Amazing.
Here we have a John Deere binder. It's in transport position, so it looks a little different than what it would be in the field. The tongue is actually out here and the horse is out where you're standing. And you go down the edge of the field and cut the grain. Now this transferred the grain in here, and it also tied it into bundles, dropped them into the fork back here, and we accumulate 3 or 4, and then you could dump them at once so they were in a nice row. So when the people came along to shock it, it was right there, and they just stand them up. This machine, it's got the twine in it, it's ready to go. It was actually used, I'm going to guess, probably over 30 years ago. Stuart Anderson down on the Arapahoe Road east of Boulder was going to thrash with his Avery undermount steam engine that fall with one of the big yellow fellow separators. And they knew Dad had this, so they borrowed it and cut about 5 acres of wheat with it so they could thrash. So it is in shape, ready to go, and hasn't been used since, but it would go to the field if you needed to.
Very good. Up until, every year we run one of these about 3 or 4 weeks before we have the Yesteryear Farm Show. And we use a McCormick Deering grain binder, which is almost identical to this, except it's red. And we cut either barley or oats or wheat. This year we cut wheat, and we hand load it onto bundle wagons and bring the bundle wagons here to the museum. And we have our show, and we do threshing right out here next door in the field. The weekend before Labor Day weekend here at the Dougherty Museum in Longmont, Colorado. So I'm well familiar with
pitching bundles,
pitching bundles, and loading wagons and running the binder.
I might add, descendants of Stuart Anderson still operate a couple of steam tractors, maybe 3 of them, an Avery undermount and a couple of cases. And almost every year they have a steam tractor here running to help run the separator. So I'm glad to see that they've kept that up, of course, and they repair those engines, put new flues in the boilers, and keep them up where they pass state inspection.
Yep.
And it's no small task. And getting them here on a lowboy is a significant expense that they do themselves. So
Indeed, indeed.
very appreciative of that. A little further information on how this works in the field. This wheel is a transport wheel, and one on the other side. They come right off. Then you set it on the ground. And there's a big wheel under here. It's called the bull wheel. And it's what actually drives this machine, the mechanism. You have 3 horses on a team hooked up out here, and their job is to pull it, but also it's a drag on horses because of this bull wheel. There's a lot of resistance to run this thing. So it's hard on horses. You had to rest them periodically. It wasn't just something you could go in the field and just keep running steady. The driver operator sits up there on that seat, and those levers control the height of the cutting deck here, and also at the times the table over here, or catch table, to when that will dump it, he controls that. This item is a buckboard. They were a lightweight horse-drawn utility vehicle, more or less. There's a little box back here. Even has a tailgate that drops. So if you ran to town to get a few supplies, you might use something like this. I think the Cartwrights, if I remember right, were using something like this quite often to go to the Virginia City.
Aha.
And again, it has some of the original paint and original leather in it yet. So that's the kind of thing, again, that my father looked for. You can't see it, but there's a socket over there for the whip to be in. And there's even a little footrest in here. So, again, they're a very common item. Probably a lot of them were made, and probably got a lot of hard use.
I don't see any brakes.
No, something this light.
Didn't need
Didn't
brakes.
need it.
The horses were the brakes.
Hopefully the horse didn't run away, and if it did, you jumped off, I guess. In the back here,
Doug, what in the world what kind of saddle is this?
Well, that's a lady's side saddle.
Looks comfy.
I'll take your word for it. That belonged to my mother's aunt, believe it or not. So
Holy
that's
mackerel.
why that's here. Little stirrup there, you see, for a dainty foot and a dainty shoe. What we have here, Bob, is a sugar beet planter. It actually plants 4 rows at a time. The seed is put in this hopper, horse-drawn. These fold down to make a scratch in the line so that you know what to guide on the next pass.
Ah.
And you can see that line right through between the horses, I hope, so you know how to steer it, so you get your row spacing as near as correct as possible. Sugar beets were a big item in this area. The sugar factory was built, I'm probably wrong, but around 1907, I think. And that and the Cuner-Impson canning factory were major economic forces in this area for many years. And sugar beets were a good cash crop, and many farmers grew them. So this was up in good shape. It'd probably go to the field and work yet today. And again, sugar beets played a big part in the development of this area. The machine behind me is a John Deere horse-drawn mowing machine. The mower bar lays down when you're in the field and you cut alfalfa or any other weeds, whatever thing like that you wanted to cut. John Deere made thousands of these, hundreds of thousands of these models.
I noticed that the sickle bar is virtually the same on this as it was on the reaper and on the binder.
Yeah, I'm sure that's correct. That wheel there drives it through the gear, and this wheel revolves here, and that gives you the sickle motion back and forth. And again, a very successful machine and very popular.
Now, Doug, don't they sometimes refer to a planter like this as a grain drill?
Well, they're very similar to it. This was a specialized made for beets, but a grain drill operates very similar to the same thing. You have a gear-driven shaft across there that revolves a tube with slots cut in it that measures the seed, and you can adjust that back and forth to adjust your rate of seed that you're dropping to get your seeds the right distance. Seeds until the modern era were multi-germ, which means a beet seed might send up 6 plants.
From one seed?
From one seed. So you had to come along and thin the beets, and at that time it was a matter of taking fingers and pulling out the extra so you only had one left. And then you wanted to space them about so far apart, so you took a hoe and did that, and this hand's thinning, and it was, the first operation was on your knees.
Wow.
To do it right. You could not do that standing up, or if you could back would take it, you could bend over and do that. But needless to say, back-breaking work. This item is a one-horse walking grain drill. And you see the width of it. Corn at this time was planted in 48-inch rows.
48 inches apart.
And this would fit right between the rows.
Pulled by a horse.
Pulled by a horse. And so a lot of times they would plant the wheat, winter wheat, in September in the standing corn.
Ah.
And get the wheat a head start. And I think if the corn was very tall, that was probably a hot and buggy job, because you're walking down between there, you're not going to get any breeze following this horse. This one came off the Autry farm, which was located at the intersection of Lookout Road and 95th. It was obviously kept in the barn its whole life. It's upside down, but you see the name there, Kentucky, all original paint, and it would go to work today for you if you needed it.
So the horse pulled this, the ground, the big front wheel dragged on the ground and turned, and that chain made the mechanism work that fed the seed
Exactly
down
right.
the tubes.
And Bob just told me he restored one of these, so he's quite well acquainted with how they work.
2 years ago, yeah.
Okay. This is a little mill here that would grind or break up the corn kernels. And it's run, this one could have been run by a small tractor or belted up over here. You dump the cobs in here and it augered them in there through that mill. And you can set the fineness you wanted, I believe. And again, a lot of farms probably had these if they had a flock of chickens, and I'm sure about 100% everybody did in those days on a farm. So just another little item that was in common use.
Yes, indeed.
This is a corn sheller, two-hole corn sheller. I'll let Bob tell about that. He's well acquainted. And go ahead and tell your story about the last weekend, Bob.
Sunday we had a open cabin day at Old Mill Park, and we had a corn sheller set up and a hand corn grinder. We brought a load of ears of corn, dried ears of corn, and we let the kids shell the corn. And you would put the ears of corn in here, and they would go down. There's 2 holes here and some wheels down in there with burrs on them that when you turn the crank, it turns the wheels and pulls the corn down and takes the kernels off of the ears. And the kids loved it. They had a great time. And then we also had a corn grinder that the kids could take then the kernels of corn and put them in the corn grinder and grind the corn up into chicken feed. You could also set the corn grinder finer to grind finer and actually make cornmeal and make cornbread. Yes.
About to raise that possibility with you, that cornmeal was quite popular. My dad loved his cornmeal. And he'd make his cornbread every evening in the wintertime when the mood struck him. And it was not Johnny cake, it was cornbread. There was no sugar in it. So
it's amazing how dirty those ears of corn are when they go in, but how clean the ground cornmeal is when it comes out.
Okay. This item behind here is a hay press. Again, they use one of these at the farm show every year, do some baling of straw. This machine came out of North Park. It was owned by the Everly Austin family, and it baled a lot of hay in North Park in the wintertime. They baled the hay off the stacks that had been put up in August. And it was a high quality Timothy hay, and it was shipped to Kentucky for racehorses. That was their market. That's why they went to the trouble of baling it. And again, it's called a hay press, and it was stationary. It had a table that came out here that you could put the hay up on, and somebody fed it into this area here, and this arm goes up and down that compacts it. And this big drive shaft piston shoves it back. Back here you see some blocks that are used to divide the bales. And then they're wire tied by hand. And again, if I want to see one work, every summer at the show they've got one working with about 4 or 5 men to operate it.
It's powered with a belt that goes to this pulley here, and that goes to a tractor. Typically the belt is 40 feet long or so, big wide rubber kind of conveyor belt material, and it turns this big wheel here, and there's big bull gears in here that all the momentum that it gains powers the machine.
They were replaced by the balers that are towed around the field by a tractor today, but in those times everything was brought to it and hand-fed. What we have here is a corn binder. This is McCormick Deering. Again, it's horse-drawn over here behind me, driven by a bull wheel to power the mechanism. And this goes down the corn row, and the corn is fed in here. These fingers grab it and pull it on in. There's a little sickle down in there, about this long, just like the mowing machine had, that cut the stalk off. It goes on back into it, and it's tied with twine like the grain binder. And they come out the bin and laid in piles, and I came along and stood those up and shocked them till they dried also. And then it was fed through a machine that ground the whole thing up. Now this corn might be dry or wet. If you're feeding the silage cutter, you're doing a green corn. If you wanted fodder, you waited till it was dried out and mature, and then a mill would hammer that whole thing up again. But again, the corn and stalk was all fed together. It wasn't separated.
Ah.
That was a corn picker that picked the ears off, which we don't have one of those. But behind it's another binder, similar design, used for the same purpose.
The mechanism of the corn binder is a lot like the mechanism of the grain binder, except it's vertical instead of horizontal.
Exactly right. This is a vertical binder. The one behind you is a horizontal. They had two different designs.
Aha.
And so that was a matter of preference, what you wanted to use. A safety issue might come into play. There were no guards to speak of on any of this equipment, so you had to be careful or you'd lose a finger or hand, and that just about can be said on any of this early farm equipment. And even today, these modern combines are shielded up so you can't see any mechanism, and then you might see one where the shields are removed because they're just in the way all the time. Farmers just take them off and leave them in the yard, but at their own risk. But, farming was and is a very hazardous occupation.
It is. It is.
Bob, here we've got a big machine. This is a 6-hole corn sheller.
Whoa.
This was a commercial setup rather than just a little 2-hole for the family use for a few chickens. This machine is in working condition, believe it or not. I saw it work. The item laying on top is actually the cob conveyor. After the corn is shelled, the cobs come off here, and that piece of equipment hooks under here, and takes off the side and pile cobs. You might get a pile of cobs, big pile of cobs if you're working steady.
Wow.
My dad always liked to see stuff work and run, and so he found a way to do that with this. One year they combined the corn out here. They found there was quite a few ears on the ground. So he got my brother and I out there with a pickup, and we picked up corn till we had a pickup load of ear corn. And he hooked one of the tractors to it, belted it up. And my brother and I and my dad were with scoop shovels. We're shoveling corn into the back here as fast as we could, and it just took it all. The clean grain came off here, the cob's out there. And so I know it works.
Aha.
A little aside, my grandmother liked to use cobs for cooking in the summertime.
In the stove.
In the stove, or for kindling any time. And the reason they liked them in the summertime, it made a quick fire that wasn't really hot, like coal or wood would be, so you didn't have a lot of excess heat in the house or the kitchen. So cobs found several uses of that, being one of them that was the housewife liked them.
Aha.
Again, a nice machine that has some of the original paint on it and striping yet. And again, I can't emphasize it too much. That's what got my dad interested with something had some of the original paint on it yet. This truck was donated to the collection by the Marshall family. Tom Marshall had this truck from about, this drill I should say, from about 1930 on. He wore out a early model Ford V8 truck, and then he put it on this K5 International chassis. That folds up, and they drilled water wells with it. About every water well on a farm or around Longmont was drilled with this rig. I don't know too much about them. I know this is a prototype that started this design, and the family told me that the company thought enough of this that they came and got the truck, cleaned it up, and painted it for them. They took it to a convention in Houston, had it in the hotel lobby.
Wow.
So it means something to some people, and that's why you see it in a pretty nice condition today. And again, the Tom Marshall family of Longmont, as the sign shows. So, and many farmers around here that will tell you they drilled a well for them. Quick note on the truck, it's actually a KB6. It was the heavier duty model international truck at that time, cast wheels. The windshield can come out a little bit to get you some air on a hot day. And a good old reliable heavy duty truck. This is another piece of horse-drawn equipment. You see the tongue and the two-horse evener there. This is a corn planter. And you put your seed in these two hoppers, and the wheel here drove that chain, it drove the mechanism that metered the seed out. And you see that row spacing, that's probably that 48-inch spacing. So that with that horse-drawn wheat drill would go between those rows and plant your wheat while the corn was still standing. And obviously, see here, your feet did different things, control the depth, and you've even got a scraper here. The wheels were getting muddy, you'd knock that off so wheels didn't build up with mud and affect your depth. So again, a lot of engineering went into a piece of equipment like that.
They thought of everything.
So the primary reason for the width was the size of a horse to get through.
Well, a lot of the corn was dry land, and they did that on purpose. That was one reason, so to space out the row. And then, like I say, I don't know which came first, probably this, and then they said, well, we can build a wheat planter that'll fit between those rows. And get a little jump on the season by getting your wheat started in September before corn harvest time. This machine is called a horsepower machine. They were used before steam and gas engines came along to try to get some mechanized power to run a sheller or a baler or whatever you might have later powered with a belt from an engine. This would give you some shaft power. Now this is a 2-horse evener. So you had a team of horses here, and this beam, it actually had another beam bolted over there going out 180 degrees from it. So you'd have another 2 horses over there, so it was balanced up. This is the tumbling rod shaft coming out here that ran up to the machine that you were trying to operate. It was staked down, and each revolution the horses learned to step over that rod. And I don't know how long that took them to get used to that moving shaft, but they adapted to it, I guess. Again, the horses walked in a circle, and as they turned this, that turned that gear mechanism, and it gears up until you get a fairly decent shaft speed coming off here. I've never taken the time to count the sprockets in this gear. You can mathematically figure out what it's going to do, the multiplier. It's mounted on a frame here, so it's somewhat easily to move. My dad found this old gnarled piece of wood somewhere and decided that would make a good thing to bolt on here. I can remember taking a grinder and working on this and brightening it up. It's actually kind of an interesting piece of wood.
It is. It looks like a big old tree branch.
Yeah.
And then there's this place over there where the other beam was on for the other 2 horses.
So it's primitive, but I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in the undeveloped world they're still using something like this to lift water or whatever.
Yep.
Again, the whole idea was the teams to walk in a circle around this, pivoting around this shaft, and for how many hours it took to get the job done.
And the horses would just go and go and go.
Yep, they probably got trained to it. It didn't take any attention much. Probably some man standing in the middle giving them voice commands, if anything, and away they went.
I'll be darned.
This implement is a sugar beet puller, a 1-row puller, horse drawn. There's 2 knives under here. They're even a little shiny. You oil this lever and you blow them into the ground. They suck into the ground as you're going down the beet row, and the beets are popped onto the surface. Just pops them up on top and all. So the next step was to come along with a beet knife, which is about this long with a hook on the end of it. You'd hook that beet, pick it up with this hand, and slice the top off. And then you move to the next one. And it was just a constant motion. And they'd pull an A down the row that made a flat spot, and you'd throw the beets into little piles. Then the next step was to come along with a beet fork and load the beets into the wagon and later into the truck by hand.
Wow.
Up here we can show you a picture of that process, the still.
So the only mechanized part of it was digging the beet out of the ground.
Yeah.
After that, it was all manual.
Yeah, this got them out of the ground on top. They do the same thing with potatoes, get them on top, and then they could hand sort them. So I don't know if they tried to dig them by hand before this. I assume this came with the start of the sugar beet. The front of it's the planter that we talked about earlier, 4 rows, but this would just pull 1 row at a time.
Is that a Model A truck?
It's a brand new Model A truck, 1930. This is my father, Ray Dougherty. His brother, Clyde's behind him. Here's 3 horses pulling a beet puller through the field.
The one we just looked at?
Yep, could be.
Yeah.
Here's the A, they called it, has made a little smooth path in the field, and here you see the top beets.
Oh, yeah.
That has a beet fork, and there the beets are, the truck's about full. They're about ready to go to the dump.
Can't beat that.
And where was the dump in those days?
Plum beet dump was just on the other side of Boulder Creek, east of county line. And it was a Great Western had a rail line there, and they transport the beets to the factory by rail from there.
Have you ever seen the beet dump in Meade? You should go to Meade on Road 5 or 7.5, and there's a mountain of sugar beets right now. You can get a beet, and they're hard as a brick, and you can cut a chunk off with your pocket knife and chew on it, and it's as sweet as a teaspoon of sugar.
Yeah, the sugar beet processing season ran into the new year usually, into January. was a normal run, as I memory recall. Here you see the green tops that had been hot off with the knife. After the trucks were out of here, they would come in with a pitchfork, and you'd gather them up into little piles. And you'd have a pile every 10, 12 feet. And they'd cure. And then you'd go back and load them with a fork onto a wagon. Cattle and horses loved them. Maybe because part of that top was sweet, that you mentioned.
I bet it was.
It was a great feed. And now they have these belt-driven defoliators that just whack the top all up into pieces you can't hardly find, and then they pull the beet. So that top business all went away, but the top and the beet is green are still in the soil, so they go back into the soil, so you still get the recycled nutrients, I guess you'd say. But I piled a few beet tops myself, and I had a pair of burros at that time. They loved them too.
The burros.
Yeah. If you fed them to your cows, you had to be careful. It would change the flavor of the milk.
Really?
Some people might like it or not care for it.
Uh-huh.
The next two items are cutters or sleighs. I always like this one a little better because of the curvature of the dash and the runners. It still has quite a bit of the original paint and upholstery on it. Here's your little whip socket. We've actually used these a little in the wintertime with a horse and later with the burros. They're a lot of fun, as quiet as they can be to slip along. Effortlessly to pull, drag for the horse, virtually effortless. And this is kind of the Currier and Ives look here at this sleigh that you see around Christmas time.
That's all steam bent wood, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah. This is rounded and it's just really a nice cutter.
And the horse would stand right in there.
Yeah, between these, step in here, these come up to around the collar up here, just leather strap, and again, not much draft, so you didn't have to have any heavy.
You didn't need a harness, you just needed the collar.
Yeah. This is a mail delivery cart. It was used on Route 4, which was northeast of Longmont. This back door opens how you get in. It still has some of the original leather upholstery. After the mailman was in and seated, this folded down his seat. You can sit on that. The windows will go up for the summertime. There's two little slots there that the rains would go through in inclement weather.
So this is the front up here,
Yeah.
and that's the back.
At the back, and one horse cart. So it was the original paint. You got the flag on it here. And Dad found this. It was stored upstairs in the old Cleland Ford garage here in Longmont. And nobody knew quite how it got there or how long it had been there. But that's why it's in the shape it is. It was out of the weather.
So the mailboxes were just like they are now out in the country
Yeah.
on the side of the road.
Yep.
And the mailman would reach through the window
Put the mail in. Yep.
put the mail in the mailbox.
RFD, Rural Free Delivery.
Rural free delivery.
Yep. I don't know the history of that, but it might have been quite an innovation at this time to have your mail delivered to your driveway.
Instead
mailbox.
of going to the post office. Uh-huh.
That's Longmont had 4 routes, I've been told, and each of the quadrants. And this was the northeast quadrant. Bob, this is a 1867 Concord stagecoach. This coach is numbered 173. You found the number on it in numerous places under its restoration. And the New Hampshire Historical Society acquired all the Abbott Downing Company records. Abbott Downing was the company that built these coaches in Concord, New Hampshire. This coach was one of an order of 10 in 1867 that was shipped west. And I don't know where it ran at first, but some of its later runs was Fairplay to Breckenridge was its last route. We do know that. That was about 1910. So it served a 45-year life. The coach sat at Tiny Town, which was a little amusement park up by Morrison for many years out in the weather, and deteriorated. When my father acquired it, the body was here in pieces, but it was very rotted out. A man named Hans Borning in Longmont, he lived on 7th Avenue. He was a retired cabinet maker and boat builder, and he was an expert at steaming and bending wood. I don't believe there's hardly 2 or 3 straight pieces in this coach. Everything's got a slight bow to it, big bows here. There's 7 different kinds of wood were used in its original manufacture, so that's what they did when they put it back together. Ash being one of the popular ones, the running gear under here, the front axle and stuff was ash. It was, I've been told, a strong wood as oak and lighter. So a lot of ash was used on these carriages. About the only original pieces on this coach are those 3 main beams. The rest of it was rotted out. We had new wheels made, but these are the original boxings and axles. And new tires put on. So they're solid as brand new, which they are. Tourists, souvenir hunters over time had taken different pieces off of it. For some reason, they like to cut this leather out and take pieces. When we got the coach, it was hanging on one thickness here. I think there's 7 of them there. It was all that was left. It was hanging.
So the whole coach kind of hangs on those leather straps.
And
That's pretty amazing.
It has this rocking motion. And I read that it was partly for the rider's benefit, but it was really for the horses. It took the shock waves off the horses. Instead of being spring-sprung, rocking straight up and down, it had a rolling motion to it, something like a ship. You have this big leather boot back here for storage. You had storage on top. They had a footrest that came across here. Some people could sit up there and rest their feet here facing backwards. The same up front. The driver and shotgun guard, if necessary, sat here. There was people sat up there with their feet between the driver and the shotgun guard. And 9 people inside. So they loaded these up, needless to say.
Wow.
So they were heavy duty to stand the roads, and like out here in the mountains, you're on the rock, going up these trails into the canyons and stuff. There's a picture in some magazine of Boulder taken at the gold rush period when everybody was in a hurry to get up to the canyon. And there must be 15 to 20 people on one of these with gear piled all over it and 4 horses. I'm thinking, pull this rig up Boulder Canyon with all that weight on it. It was hard on the horses. But the coaches obviously could take it. They were so well built. They sold 9 seats inside. This folded up so that you could get access to the back seat. We have a leather strap here for a backrest for these people. The back seats and front seat are fairly comfortable. When we were restoring this, we found out that the Wells Fargo Bank in San Francisco, their main office, had an original that was still in excellent condition. My dad and I went out there and were allowed to get in it, access it, photograph the leather patterns, the trim and the ceiling, so we could duplicate it as close as possible. This was a favorite piece of my dad. He put a lot of sweat equity into it himself, and he always enjoyed working on it and the history it represented.
Very nice.
This lever,
That's the brakes?
that's the brake. You have to put on here to push these into the wheels. These leather straps I mentioned were missing, so with Dad being kind of creative and a recycler, I guess before that term was used, took old heavy harness and made these straps, planed them down, So each one, so they glue together, be the same thickness. Spent a lot of time doing that job.
Wow.
Now you never know the difference. They're not original.
A wood block on a steel tire.
Yep. Tire is the right word. That's what
Yep.
these were called. These were heated up, expanded, and then put on the wood wheel. And when they cooled, they shrank. And that's what made that tire, the wheel, tight and kept it together. And if they got really loose, they'd heat them up, take a little section out, weld it back together, go through the process again. And I imagine running these over rock roads, that might have happened once in a while.
The blacksmith also had a tire shrinker,
Yeah.
and it was a crimper that they'd heat the tire up, put it in there, pull that, it would squeeze the tire, make a dimple in it.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Underneath is one of the tongues that went in here for the first team, and then they had other bars that went out there. 6-horse team was common on these for the long distance work. We have never put live horses on it. My dad was afraid. Well, you know, horses aren't worked every day. How you take a team out at pasture, put them on. The last thing you wanted was a runaway issue.
Yeah, you don't want to. You want to break it.
You work horses every day, then you have some confidence in them. But when they're worked infrequently, it's a little iffy sometimes. And I remember Dad talking about when he was a kid growing up, runaway horse team or a single horse was something that happened.
Oh yeah.
That was one advantage I've been told of donkeys or mules. They might get surprised and spooked by something, but a few 100 yards or 100 yards down the road, they decided the threat was over and they'd stop. Some horses would just go crazy and literally run off. Couldn't stop them. These are side curtains rolled up here. They'll roll down, they feed through these eyelets. You tie them down to keep rain out. There's actually a glass window in each door. The strap is gone on this one, but that pulls up and hooks. So you actually have a glass window here.
Wow.
So they could be made fairly all weather. And again, the big boot and back was a covered storage area. And you see pictures of them, there's trunks piled on top. Most of the gear was carried up there. And Bob, you might enjoy looking at that. That's hand blacksmithing work, all that railing up there. That was here, that hadn't disappeared. And so you got a handhold there to get up with. And
Those rails are punched through, and
Yeah.
and so are the uprights. They're punched, and then the rod strings through the holes. Neat.
This piece of equipment here is a 2-horse Berlin carriage. You see pictures of the big cities like New York City back in the late 1800s. You'll see these all over the street. They were chauffeur driven, I guess you'd call it. Hard rubber tires, leather fenders. Here you have a shield here that if the wheels were picking up any mud or anything, this would catch it so it didn't throw it up on the side glass. This still has some of the original upholstery in it. You notice this shield comes over the step plate here so that when the lady gets in or out, that's clean. That hasn't got any mud
That's
on
got
it.
all the mud on it.
Yeah.
I see.
So that's curtains for privacy, pull down. This front suspension up here is, I believe it's called a fifth wheel, just like your fifth wheel trailers today. You got these 2 plates here that when the tongue turns, it's riding on that surface there. And it's spring sprung. Gave a very nice ride, I'm sure, in the cobblestone streets of the big cities. That's where these pigs probably hardly ever got off of that. And I don't know, I just caught my dad's eye at a swap meet back in Hershey, Pennsylvania one year, and he bought it. So
Very good.
The piece in front of it, I don't know if we get on camera on that or not. It's a little buggy. Sometimes I've been called a doctor's buggy. We go out and make calls in the country. It's just typical of that era of a little 1 or 2 horse buggy. Very light. Again, this one has some of the original striping showing on it yet. A little bit of the paint, the leather, it's all original. Very typical piece for a small buggy. This big piece of equipment is a thrashing machine or separator. It took the shocked grain and separated the wheat from the straw or the barley, whatever you're doing. This is the stacker. This swiveled around and made a big straw stack behind you. The clean grain's coming off this pipe into a wagon. This machine was one of the DeBaker family on Arapahoe Road. I mentioned Stuart Anderson before. He's a descendant of that family, married into it, I assume. They had 2 of these that they thrashed custom work for. And my dad was able to get one of them. They still have the other one. And quite an historic piece, all wood. This was before the galvanized metal came along. I've seen a few of these, but they've been allowed to sit out in the weather and they're in terrible shape. They're so in demand. I've heard of a couple of them being restored, even at that.
Wow.
On the back, there's a nice picture of the factory and stuff. We might get a shot of that in a still later. But this was a big one, a 36-inch. A lot of them, individual farmer might have one. It might be a 28-inch or 24. But these bigger ones were used to travel around the neighborhood and thrash for other people as a custom business. And again, Bob's well acquainted with Thrasher. They run one every year at the farm show and thrash a couple times a day. I believe you were pitching bundles this year.
3 times a day.
Okay. And again, this was a piece my dad liked because it was wood and still had some of the original paint and lettering on it. This chute in front up here, it's for conserving space, we don't have it in position. That actually hinges out. The bundle wagons would come in on each side and they pitch the bundles into that moving conveyor that took the shocked grain bundles into the machine. And again, if somebody wants to see one work, come to the Yesteryear Farm Show at the end of August.
Yes. The belt is about 100 feet long, and it hooks up on a
This one's on that side.
big belt pulley on the other side.
I believe this reel here is for winding it up when you're moving it.
The belt.
Yeah.
Yeah. We run our threshing machine with a 1907 Case steam. They call it traction engine. Most people call it a steam tractor, but the proper term is traction engine. And yeah, Doug was talking about this being a 36-inch versus a 20-inch, and what he's talking about is the width of the cylinder that flies around up there and tears the grain off of the stalk that it's on. The stalk is called the straw, and then the grain is whatever it is, wheat, barley. The straw comes out that big chute, which is off to the back. The grain comes down through the machine. There's a big sieve, and the grain comes through the sieve, it lands in the bottom, and then comes up this chute. There's an auger that takes it over to the other side, and it deposits it in a wagon. And a lot of the threshing machines have a measuring device that fills up and dumps and fills up and dumps, and a counter that counts how many times that happens, and that's how they know how many bushels they have threshed.
You can actually see that mechanism up through there. I came from where I'm standing. I can see the counter and the trip mechanism, and they trips every half bushel. Most of them do, and so a farmer might, if he thought he was being shortchanged on the count, he'd get up there with his half bushel bucket and make sure he was getting a full bucket, because you can adjust the weight on a bar that'll trip by the weight, and then the counter will count one. And it, like you say, it was all done by, there was no scales, it was all by that counter up there, how much grain went a day went through it. And I know some of the guys that liked it, if they couldn't get 1,000 bushels a day through it, something was wrong. They were running a little slow.
What do you suppose that weighs?
I don't know.
Tons.
Yeah, it's heavy. Well, as Bob mentioned, they had a 1907 tractor on it. So, and again, the family had two of them. They had an Avery undermount tractor and a case. And in later years, when they quit running the steamers, they put two 2-ton Caterpillars on one machine and had them built up on each side.
Wow.
And I think they still have one or both of those 2-tons over there on the family farm, the Caterpillar tractor. They were gas powered, and a whole lot less maintenance and work to run one of those than it is to keep a steamer going.
When did the combines come out?
In the 30s, late 20s and 30s, but honest with you, in this area it was irrigated, and so we had heavy crops, heavy straw, and the early combines didn't have the capacity to handle it. And I know that one of the engines back here was still being on a separator in 1948.
Uh-huh.
So you get 100, 150 bushel of grain, you got the straw and volume, the combines just choke on it. They just couldn't handle it. So they were still thrashing with separators.
So a combine combines the binder and the threshing machine into one machine, so that the combine can go through the wheat field and cut the wheat and separate it and leave the straw and blow the grain into like a semi. Where that's why it's called a combine, is because it combined the separator and the binder.
Binder, shocking, all that process. Yep. Cool. Here we have an early gas tractor, Hart Par. This one was made in 1913. They brought this model out, I believe, in about 1906. It's a 2-cylinder. Engine lays flat, and I believe it's a 10-inch bore and a 15-inch stroke. And my calculator was working right, that figured out 2,250 cubic inches.
2,250 cubic inches. But yet it's only rated 30 horsepower drawbar?
Correct.
And 60 horsepower belt.
On the belt.
And
there's the belt right there. This is something that would run that separator. This particular tractor was found up east of Chugwater, Wyoming. There's a table of land up there, a good wheat land. And with it was an 8-bottom John Deere breaking plow, sod breaking plow to break the prairie. These things were in their element breaking sod. They did it on a custom basis. It was a horse killer job to do it with horses. And it rolled it over in a nice gentle roll, and then they disked it up over time, and the grass roots broke down. Grass roots broke down. The cooler up there is actually filled with oil. It's an oil-cooled engine. They operated at fairly high temperature. Once you got them going on gas, you turned them over to kerosene. It was a cheaper fuel and had more power and more heat in it, I believe. Again, it survived in pretty good condition. The motor was stuck when Dad acquired it, and it took him a long time to get it loose, but he did. We got it running. You can open that hatch back in there and actually see the crankshaft and the connecting rods and the pistons. And I can kind of visualize my dad through that little hole in there with penetrating on a hammer, tapping on things. This process went on for weeks. It didn't just happen overnight. And he finally got it freed up. And we didn't crank it. We actually belted it up with another tractor to spin it and get it going that way. But they were successful. They made quite a few of them. Hartpar turned into Oliver later. And Hartpar was one of the pioneers of developing the gas tractor. This was their biggest model, and very successful tractors, run for many years. An 8-bottom John Deere braking plow. It was used to brake the sod, and they did that on a custom basis for people. I'm guessing a couple dollars an acre or something to break it, but that was at the time, that was quite a bit of money.
So that would have been 8 plowshares in virgin prairie grass that had never been plowed ever. So it's the hardest work that this could have done, and times 8, you know. Amazing thing is that the horsepower rating for this tractor doing that kind of work called drawbar work was 30 horsepower. 30. Now my little Sears Craftsman garden tractor is rated at 18 horsepower. And it can do nothing but mow my lawn, you know. So this could do the work of 30 actual horses, pretty much.
Different horses, weren't they?
Different horses.
They had a rating system. They hooked these up to a pony brake, I believe it was called. It could give resistance, and they could rate them. And the state of Nebraska early on passed a law that if you wanted to sell your tractor in Nebraska, you had to go through the Nebraska testing process. And they decided what your horsepower rating was going to be. And if you were a little optimistic, they corrected you, or you didn't sell your tractor in the state of Nebraska. So that was the standard for many years, the Nebraska test. This one steers like a lot of them do with this chain. You've got this worm gear, the steering rod comes down, you've got a worm gear there that turns that bar, and it winds the chain up one side or releases the other side, and these chains are what actually steer the tractor. And sitting still, you can't move them, but when you're moving, it steers easily.
You crank the wheel.
You've got a lot of gear reduction. Yeah. And a little bounce and vibration to the tractor. They're really not hard to steer in motion. But when you're maneuvering to get one lined up with a separator and get the belt just right, that's not something for a beginner.
You do a lot of cranking.
The Homestead Act early on was 160 acres, and I believe it became 320. And if you were trying to break them with horses yourself, you'd just do maybe 20 acres a year or something. So if you had the funds, you hired this guy to come in and do the whole job at once. You could go to putting the whole thing into production. As an aside, I've never seen one of these sod cutters, but they were about so long, and they'd knife in and cut a strip, and you'd cut it into sections, and that's how they built the sod houses, the soddy. And there's a few of them surviving out in the farm country near Araba. And after they build them and then they plaster them, you don't really realize what it is till you go inside and see how deep the windows sills are and things like that. And they were very easy to heat, and they were cool in the winter, summertime. So it was a very practical way to build a home. And again, that went on when you had the virgin sod to cut into the pieces and layer them together, just like building with building blocks. And I know that they were really very successful, efficient homes. I don't know whether that'll come back today or not in our quest for efficiency, probably doubt it, but I guess we'll move on to another big tractor down the line. This tractor is steam powered. Bob, it's an Altman Taylor. The next tractor we'll move to is also an Altman Taylor. Altman Taylor built gas and steam at the same time. Steam was maybe on its way out, gas was coming in. There was an overlap period there. This is the biggest model they made, a 2575, and again it's steam. And there's a whole different way of rating steam at this time, I think. But anyway, it was a big tractor, it would do a lot of work. An interesting sidelight on this tractor, it was owned by Norman Thronson. His farm was down here at the intersection of 287 and 52 on the northeast corner. The buildings and stuff are still there. I have a picture in the back here, we might get to it, showing Thorvald and Norman, his brother. Thorvald we have his engine in here too. He lived over on Nelson Road, just north of the new high school, Silver Creek. And the big horse barn there has been covered in metal siding, so you don't realize it's an old wood structure. But it must have held 30-some horses at one time, a huge barn.
Wow.
And it's a good thing they put the metal on it to preserve it, but it changed the looks of it entirely. But otherwise, the weather would have gotten to it over time, probably. But anyway, this engine, like I say, thrashed in this area southeast of Longmont. My dad remembered this engine coming to their farm to thrash in 1918 and 19. Saw it pull in the yard. He was still a young boy. And during the 30s, the engine left this area and kind of disappeared. Dad didn't know where it was. And somebody was up hunting near the Caribou Ranch and found it at the Bluebird Mine. And the county has restored the Bluebird Mine and made it available to the public. So you can go up there and see the same site. It was on the railroad grade, I believe it was the Switzerland Trail that went all through the mountains, all the gold mines and camps up there. It was quite a railroad network, if you ever read a book about it, called the Switzerland Trail. Anyway, my dad found this engine, went up and visited, saw that it was in a shed. A building had been built over it to protect it from the weather, and they used it, we believe, to run an electric generator, a dyno, for the mine. And he located the owner by tax records, who was in Texas, and was able to purchase it. And the man said, one condition, you've got to put the building back just like you found it. And it didn't have a door, it was built after the tractor went in there. So that presented a bit of a problem. I remember going up there for a week every day. I was 10 years old. And the Thorvald Thronson went with us. And I didn't realize at the time, but this was his brother's engine, so Thorvald had probably been around it anyway and got it running. But during the 30s, during the scrap drive, vandals, or whatever you want to call it, had broken in there, and they'd taken the smokestack off and the front firebox door and the firebox door. Anything they could bust with a hammer and get some cast iron, they'd broken it off of it. So a lot of temporary patches were made to get it steamed up, because they figured the only way to get it out of there is to get it steamed up and drive it out on the railroad grade about 5 miles to the highway, the dirt road then going north out of Nederland. So that was quite a little process, but Thorvald was a steam man through and through, and they got it going. I remember to get it out of the shed after taking the end off, we'd wrap a rope around that flywheel and hook it on the pickup, and pickup would run 50 feet, and that'd make a few revolutions, and the tractor would move a couple feet. Then you get up there and wind the rope up again and do it again. And once you had it outside, then they could fire it up. And so one day they arranged for Golden Transfer to bring his lowboy up there on the dirt road, and we met him, drove it out with no problems. I had fun because I got to drive the truck out following the procedure, but again, at 2 miles an hour, I couldn't get into a whole lot of trouble.
When you were 10 years old?
Yeah. Of course, I'd driven stuff on the farm before. But anyway, it had enough steam to go up on the lowboy. It came down Boulder Canyon and rolled it off right out here. Had enough steam pressure on it to back it off. So it was used several years here thrashing on the farm. My dad would shock about 10, 15 bushels of acres of barley, just as an excuse to play with these things. And neighbors would come over and help. People around here, Howard Morton for one, had been raised on steam, running his dad's custom outfit, Howard Morton of Morton Heights. And I can remember my job. At that time I would sit up here and I knew how to shut things down if something was going bad. That was my extent of it. I missed out on that pitching bundles era. Yeah, you just put the belt over that big wheel and then it runs up to the separator. And RPM, I'm totally guessing 250 maybe, something like that. I really don't know what the separators required. But if you could run a cross belt by turning it, it was much easier to control it in a wind. If you had a side wind with a straight belt, it might throw it off sometimes. So if you could run a cross belt, and with a steamer you can run it either way, so you could always run a cross belt if you wanted to, because the separator has to turn a predetermined direction of rotation. Several hours from cold, you'd start them on a wood fire first to raise the temperature slowly, and then once you had them good and warm and maybe a little steam pressure, then you'd fire them with coal. You get a lot more heat out of it. But it's always a good idea to bring them up slowly on wood. This was a water tank. That's not original, but it was put on here to run. And to keep one of these running, you had to have in the early days, they had a team with a water wagon that was running pretty steady all the time from a water source to the tractor to pump it off by a hand pump and go get another load. Coal, we could bring that in a wagon. Well, that wasn't too big an issue as far as keeping it going during the day, but water definitely was a big issue. This area was fortunate in we had good south mountain water, so you didn't have scale built up in the boiler like you would in the hard water areas farther east. And so steam was very successful and popular in this area. They ran them a long time. Does the sign tell me that this one doesn't? It's probably around 26,000. I'd guess 13 ton. These tractors going down the county roads caused a lot of bridge improvement to happen. You see old pictures of them where they broke through a wood bridge made for the horse era. And this wheel is kind of interesting. It's cast. It's a one-piece cast wheel. Now, I don't know how they did that. Most of them are in sections, maybe two halves put together. There's no break in it. And it's cast iron, it's about an inch thick right here, and the lugs, it's all one piece. Altman Taylor was a popular company. They made a whole line of equipment, thrashing machines, a full line of equipment, anything you wanted, pretty much. I think Altman Taylor you get with the Altman Taylor brand. The engine next one we'll move to is also an Altman Taylor. It's their gas tractor, the biggest gas tractor model they made. And it was used in this area to thrash also. It was brought in here from Nebraska in the mid-40s during World War II and was used to thrash in this area. Again, the combines weren't handling it in the area. People were still thrashing. And we'll get into it a little further. The Thronson brothers, Thorvald and Norman, were significant operators in this area handling grain for many farmers. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is an Altman Taylor tractor, gas powered. They actually started them on gas, and after they get warmed up good, they switch over to kerosene again. But this was their biggest gas model, 3060. Made at the same time they were making the steam tractor, so whatever preference you had, that's what you purchased. We had this tractor out on the field for the show 3 years ago this summer, and it was a lot of fun to get it run. It hadn't run for 20-some years. You crank this on the other side with a hand crank about so long, and it takes a little effort.
Indeed.
You don't want to have to do it too long, but if you prime it with the priming cups, and usually it takes off the impulse on the mag. If it's snapping, something's going to run. So It wasn't that hard to get going. Here, this big sprocket here, this little sprocket is what drives it. And that's coming off the transmission. You have a 2-speed forward transmission, 1 speed in reverse. I believe these wheels approach 8 feet in diameter. They even made an extension rim that you could bolt on here. It came out another 10 inches or a foot. Give you a little more traction or flotation if you needed it. Again, this tractor was brought into the Longmont area by Mr. Soddy, and he used it to thrash in the area for a few years. You can hardly make it out, but there's in places there's a little writing on the radiator up here yet. This tank in front is actually the radiator. These fan blades there create the draft to pull air through it. There's one on each side. It holds, well, I think, about 200 gallons of water to fill that radiator. Again, it's steering with the chain system, as we described a little earlier. This is the pulley that you put a belt on to run up to a separator or whatever you're trying to run. This tractor was owned by a county in Nebraska. They used it to grade roads. They were fairly popular for that. They'd pull 2 or 3 of the horse air graders if they had, and had tandem hitch and do the whole road in one pass. And again, it was a very successful tractor, very dependable, and there's actually a few of them survived because of that. Not a lot, but there's a number of them around. They're still being run today. It's a 4-cylinder inline, but it lays flat. And when it's running up there, you can see the push rods for the valves and everything working, and little spots where you can take your oil can and add a little oil occasionally, and keep things up and lubricated. It has a power oiler on it that has a pipe that runs to the main bearings in different spots like that, a drip oiler, so it takes care of itself in that way. Again, an easy tractor to run. I remember sitting up there as a young boy, and I knew how to shut it down in case something went awry. Things you kind of had to watch out for. Sometimes a kernel of barley would come back on that belt and throw it at you up there and sting a little bit. Remember that happening.